Thanks, Melissa, for the introduction, and also to Helen for the invitation. This is the first time I've met Helen, so she's got a bit of a wild card up here today. But we've had a lot of conversations about what we might cover, and there's quite a lot to cover. So my preferred kind of style would be if you see anything that's interesting at all, hopefully you will, over the next few minutes, just stop and ask any questions anytime. So I really want to stop and spend time where you guys are most interested and what's going to be most useful for you, because there's a lot to cover. So my role at the AIS is, as Melissa said, looking after performance people. Key focus is coaches. After that, in no particular order, it's just my bias, coaches, performance directors, and then CEOs. So we're taking a bit of a leadership look at the system, and then we might get to support staff eventually. But the coaching area needs a really good look. And the thing that I'm really excited about today is having this conversation about women in coaching, is I actually think it's going to help men as well. So I think that the whole coaching paradigm needs a shift, and by having this conversation more often across Australia, we're going to be able to shift the whole coaching paradigm, which will make it better for men and their coaching roles as well. So we'll get started, and I know I have to point it towards Helen. There you go. So I wanted to start just with some numbers. So this is the Australian high performance context, and when we're looking at these numbers, we're thinking about, because people are always asking for a definition of high performance, and we're reluctant to do that because we think it changes. It's a dynamic kind of industry and sector, so people come in and out of it and come back through all the time in different roles and different phases. So what we tend to look at is who are the athletes, and then who's coaching those athletes. And what we looked at was just over 2,000 athletes, and those athletes we asked to actually name their coach. So some of the coaches the athletes name aren't the names of the coaches on the teams, which is kind of interesting. And it created a whole really interesting conversation around why is that? Why do athletes actually see someone different in terms of that lead coaching role, and what's going on there? So what we ended up doing was having this list of coaches that the athletes told us who they were, and then we looked at the numbers of females in there. So we have 90 female coaches across 32 Olympic and Paralympic sports, which is not a great number when you look at it. And when we look at it too, where they're positioned in terms of visibility. So most of these women are coaching at what we call pre-elite or development level. And then it gets really interesting because we look at, well, where have they come from, these coaches? And most of the coaches have been athletes. So, and we're not talking about Olympic gold medalists, although there are some in there, or Olympic team members necessarily, or Paralympic team members. We're talking about athletes who have been part of a high performance program at some point in their career. And that makes up the majority of our coaching pool. So 93% of our coaching pool comes from people who have been part of a high performance program at state, national level at some point in their career. And then we look at the number of female athletes who are transitioning. So we know that at the Olympics in Rio in 2016 that the IOC met their target of 50-50 athlete representation. And but what we looked at here is we have 3% of our female athletes transitioning into coaching currently from the high performance sector, which again is pretty low because the female athletes win the most of the medals. And again, the female athletes make up over 50%, and there's over 53% of our population in Australia is female. So there's a whole talent pool that we aren't mining potentially in terms of helping our performance. So we're really taking that performance lens. So when we look at the major events, and we're talking about visibility now, so who are these people, and how do they have any profile at all? And this is really just Olympic and Paralympic team data. What we see is a decreasing profile. So we're getting less numbers all the time. And when we start to look at those numbers, and we only just started this work, as you can see, from London, because when I came back to Australia, there was no data. Nobody was collecting this information. So we didn't have anything to pick up and use. So we started in London and then trying to look at the nature of the problem and collect longitudinal data. What we found on the Gold Coast, which was really interesting for a home games, where we got improved performance, I think that's what we're using, the language. What we saw was that we had 15 female coaches on the team for home games. And what we found is that only 2 of those female coaches had been in Glasgow. So the retention of any female coach, once we give them this high visibility major sporting event experience, which seems to be a criteria for selection to a coaching role, and how do you get it? And then when we give it to them, we don't retain them, and then we have to start again. So we only retained 2 coaches from the Glasgow cycle, and those 2 coaches were in netball, both of them. And in Glasgow, Gold Coast, wherever we were this year, on the Gold Coast, we only had 2 female head coaches in basketball and netball. So we've got a lot of work to do, but also it provides us with a really big opportunity. So I know that you had a lot of talks today already, and I've missed the start of the morning because I was delayed on a flight in Canberra, and I also had to get a later flight out because my husband's actually in Russia watching the football. I'm married to an Englishman who likes to watch England lose all around the world, and I've been to many of those games myself over the years, and so he's in Russia, and so far he's been in 3 cities, seen 2 games, and went to one Bolshoi ballet recital, so he's well into his trip. So the numbers piece are really, and you will have seen some of this potentially this morning already around why it's really important to make sure that we deal with this disproportionality that's in the data, because when we single out and give a woman a chance in a club or in a program, we really have trouble. They have significant issues around generating trust and influence. We need a critical mass. We can't continue to put women in different programs in different positions. They're not supported, and even though we talk about supporting them or we want to support them, we don't actually set them up for success. And we've seen that in numerous professional sports across the AFL, across football, where there are single kind of role holders. So what we really want to look at is how do we create a critical mass? How do we get a significant step change this time around? And make sure that we have the numbers so that we can actually, the women in those roles actually have trust, and most importantly, trust from the athletes. So there's a big challenge around how an athlete perceives what type of coaching they actually want. And a number of athletes, when we talk to them, still want a male coach. And there are a lot of reasons why. Because most of them have never had a female coach at any point in their career. So they don't want to risk it when it gets to this pointy end, because it might be a bit funny, could sound funny, might even be odd. So they certainly don't want to risk it. And we also know that that the athletes are not really prepared in terms of how to engage in this conversation. What we also see, over here, sorry, is, wrong way. Is for us, we think that it's really stopping the growth of our system, and that impacts performance. And so we think that our system needs to grow up, it needs to be much more adult, it needs to be having adult conversations, and at the moment we're not there yet. We need to improve our performance, we need to be more innovative, take more risks. We're a really risk-averse kind of system as well. Having worked in different systems across the world, you really notice it when you come back to Australia. We have really great people, we have fantastic athletes, but we're really not providing them with the environments that they need. I really liked what James was just saying around the language he was using when he was switching between athlete, student, because what it really speaks to is the learning environment that he's focused on creating. So how do we create environments where people can learn, not just athletes, but coaches as well? We also know that, and this is a big issue in sports across the world, is that when there's less diversity, sports are less ethical. They make bad decisions, and there's integrity issues. So there's lots to be gained by having a more diverse kind of workforce in the coaching area. So we know all of this because we've had this research for 25 years. but we don't seem to be able to shift the dial still. And so having known this for 25 years, we thought, look, we'll try one more time and ask our female high-performance coaches what is really going on. So how do you actually experience our system? You know, what's it like to work in high-performance sport in Australia and get some Australian context? So this is what they told us. So this data we collected this time last year. So they said that they are highly criticised and it's gender language that's used. They said there's gender-based bias across the organisations that they work for and the programs that they're in. And there's a lack of support and criticism around, you know, again, James used the word around human. Well, people have multiple human roles. You know, we're coaches, we're parents, we're sisters and brothers, so we have multiple human roles that we're trying to juggle all the time. So how do we make sure that there's support for that in the environments that we're creating in sport? That there's a lack of support networks. We've just done a piece of research around, the social networks around female coaches, and what was really interesting is that they're quite strong when it comes to family. What they're really quite poor at is professional networks, and the lack of energy they have to give to that at the end of a working day or at the end of a working week, and how they prioritise. And just from a systems point of view, and people like me who are in a system-based role, it's just the lack of clever thinking that's out there around how to tackle this. And so these conversations are really important, to pull all the ideas together, to really harness, the different types of thinking and perspectives on how we actually shift it. Enable, better life balance. I know in high performance everyone says to me there is no life balance. I think in life there's no life balance these days, whether you're in high performance or not. And how we get positive outcomes for all genders who are working in this role, which is a really tricky, difficult role. And what this all ends up is really what they spoke about was a heightened sense of chronic life stress, and it makes them want to give up. So they are under chronic levels of stress in our environments that we're creating and that we're managing. And so what we're really interested in now is looking at stress as a lens for understanding that in more detail. So really starting to unpack that. And we've been doing a little bit of work in that over the last couple of years. Because again, as James said, when we look at teams, especially in team sports like football, stress is contagious. So if somebody isn't managing their stress and their emotional state, whether you're athletes or coaches, it's a contagion in your team. It's a contagion in your program, and other people will pick it up and wear it. So it's a really important thing to understand, and it's also important to reframe it, because stress is useful. We don't learn if we don't have enough stress, for example, in our lives. So we have to not be afraid of stress, but we have to understand what are our stress triggers, how are we managing them, and do we have the right kind of support. I wanted to mention Title IX in the US as well, because I really think it's an important moment. They just had their 45-year anniversary of this federal law in the US last year. And I really think it's an important message for the Australian context at this particular point in time, as we are really pushing the professionalisation of women's sport. So what Title IX is a really, they call it in all the literature, a simple federal law, which basically says that boys and girls get treated the same. But it's actually a civil rights act. So it's about people having the same opportunity. And by activity, one of the things that it covers off an activity is sports. So this came in 1972. And what it did is it really professionalised the women's sport in the US, and football was a great beneficiary of that. But what it did at the same time is it decreased the amount of female coaches. So an unintended consequence of Title IX in the US was female coaching of female teams went from 90% to 42% it is currently today. And so there are consequences for us not learning the lessons of the professionalisation of women's sport, and this is what they're dealing with now as an unintended consequence of giving girls a chance to play. And so So I think that it's a really important thing for the Australian context at the moment, as we see no women coaches in the AFLW and we see limited women coaches. I know Emma shared the data with you guys, and I know that she shared all data, but when you look at coaching data specifically, it's even lower. If you take out administrators and team managers and physios and everyone else, the actual coaching data is pretty low. So I think that this is something that's really important for us to consider, and something that sports organisations really need to think about as we move forward. So one of the questions I always get asked is, well, don't people just get the jobs because they're the right people or the best person for the job? So I wanted to kind of talk a little about the meritocracy myth as well here, because it's not quite like that, as you probably all know, and a lot of you are nodding. So the best person for the job doesn't always get the job. The best team doesn't always win. So what we actually find is that the paradox with meritocracy is that the more you think you're being equal and open and objective and unbiased, the more likely you are to actually bias the evaluation that you're making. And the reason why you're more likely to become biased, because you speak about your lack of bias all the time, is because you stop scrutinising your own behaviour and your own thinking patterns, and you don't monitor them in the same way that you used to. And so you actually become part of the problem. And the other thing that we find is that we all know that we have filters, we have preferences and biases, but we need to be much more conscious of them, especially when we're making evaluations around coaching, of people and roles, and how those roles are actually constructed. Because we advantage the dominant groups, which in Australia is white, old men. So, and I know that because that's what the data tells me. So we've got an ageing population, ageing coaching population. We don't have a lot of young people in it. And we have we've got like this missing generation in the middle. So we've got very young, very inexperienced, and very experienced, but ageing significantly at this end. So we tend to advantage those dominant groups. And we know that the bias that we apply is not about the gender of the team, because we know that Title IX and the professionalisation of women's sport in Australia has opened up a dual pathway, coaching pathway for men. It's opened up a dual coaching pathway for men to coach women and men. But it hasn't opened up a dual pathway for women to coach men and women. So we need to really address that, and we need to talk about it really openly, because it's just a fact. And what we tend to see still is that men are appointed to coach women's teams with no experience of coaching women all of the time, every week actually. And so, but women have to coach men to be able to coach men's teams. They need experience. So there's a real discriminatory kind of thinking around that currently. And what we end up doing is, when we do these merit-based appointments and appoint the best person, is that we reinforce the belief that we're impartial, and that, and in fact, we're actually creating the conditions where these biases are actually unleashed day after day. So the other question, so to address that whole kind of question I always get asked is, we started to do a piece of work looking at, so first of all, when I came back to Australia, I got asked all the time, are our coaches any good? And I go, I don't know, I just got back. And the second question is, how we always appoint on merit. People always told me they appoint on merit, but they couldn't describe to me what they were appointing on. So what were the capabilities, what were the behaviours, what were the mindsets, what were the belief systems that you're appointing on? And nobody could actually articulate it. So James talked about his methodology. Very few coaches can articulate their methodology, in my experience. And so that is a real gap for us. And so what we decided to do was start to profile coaches. And we started to go, well, let's see if they're any good. let's get some data. Let's put some objective data into the dialogue that we've got around merit-based appointment and are our coaches any good? And because we have a decreasing performance profile in Australia, and we know we've got good people. So let's have a look at them. And so we profiled 175 coaches. That data set's now up to about 250. And we looked at their strengths. I really think it's important that we take a strength-based approach to coaching. I think there are so many things coaches could do and say and be to a team that we need to help them understand why they're good at what they do, first and foremost, and then how they can actually close some of the gaps, which we all have. So we started to profile, and what we found was that our coaches are pretty good, actually, but they're not very well supported. And we've really dropped the ball on development in terms of providing them with really challenging development that really makes them, think differently, invites them to engage with different types of content and processes to understand their own wisdom that they hold and be able to apply it in different ways. So we found they had good leadership presence and disposition. So they were able to be, seen and experienced that way. We found that they were very developmentally focused. So they were able to really hone in on the individual development focus for their athletes, and they wanted it for themselves as well. They were inquisitive and curious, so lots of questions, lots of things unanswered, passionate, enthusiastic, very results focused, which is a good thing that we found, highly perfectionistic, so attention to detail. And the thing that they really liked was that they were actually really interpersonally sensitive. So they really did care about the people they were coaching. They really wanted were in the roles for the right reasons. And the other one around imperceptive and avoidant is really came out in our coaches really strongly when they're under pressure. So what that really means is that when our coaches are under pressure, like at an Olympic final, a World Cup final, their tendency was to move away from the athletes. So in terms of what the athletes might perceive in those moments when they think they might need their coach the most, our coaches have a tendency to not really read that situation as well as they could and to move away from the athletes. So take themselves away, their perfectionism turns them to kind of hypercritical, and there's some challenges there. The interesting thing about this data for us, though, that we really were most interested in is there is no difference between males and females in this data set. So the women bring just as much of this as the men. So we saw no significant difference from a gender perspective, and we saw no difference between individual sport coaching and team sport coaching either when we looked at it. So there's nothing that's statistically significant in this data that would suggest that. So coaching's coaching. Pretty much. Whoever you're coaching, wherever you're coaching, this stuff holds true, whether across genders, across sports, and team sports and individual. What became really interesting for us and is our area of interest now is that our very top coaches, we started to look at the difference between light and dark traits, and especially from a leadership perspective, what we found is that our coaches bring a lot more dark than light to their roles, and that within those dark traits, and a little bit about what James was speaking again is that this ability to use everything that's at your disposal as a coach. So there's a lot of positive in there as well. So if you look at something like where we have an elevation around volatility, and a lot of people will have seen that play out in high performance coaching, and these things only come out when coaches are really under pressure, but really on a good day that's passion. So what most 99 days out of 100 people would experience you as highly passionate. But what we're talking to coaches about is having strategies to manage themselves in difficult situations so that it doesn't tip to volatility. Another one would be around eccentricity. Our coaches are highly eccentric, which means they're creative. So they're creative thinkers, They like to do things that are outside the box. They're always looking for that performance edge. But how other people experience that potentially is that they don't understand what's going on. It looks a bit weird. It's not well articulated. So when it tips into eccentricity, it becomes a little bit odd. And for athletes and support staff, that can be hard to follow. So what we're starting to look at from this data set now is how do coaches not only just focus on what we call the light traits or the things that are socially acceptable, the things that are written about in the peer-reviewed data literature, but how do they actually use all of the traits that are available to them, especially our top coaches, because they bring a lot more of the things that we would say are less socially acceptable but necessary to win. So in the end, I just wanted to talk about how we might look at this problem differently and at the same time the same, because there are some things that we've been doing really well and we need to continue doing and potentially elevate even further. And so we always get about, well, how can the numbers be increased? And it is really the big question, because we've been on this decreasing profile for a long time. We're really interested in recruitment and selection, so we're getting really involved now in head coach selection and recruitment. We're getting pretty hands-on with our sports that we fund to improve their processes, to have a process first and foremost, then to improve those processes, to introduce objective data sets to reduce the bias. And you guys will know that whether you're at a club or a state or wherever, everybody's known to each other. So when it comes to selecting coaches from national teams right down, the panels are constructed and everyone is known. And so there's a huge amount of bias that's not disclosed and not talked about as we set up those processes and set up those recruitment selection panels. So, and be really clear about what we're looking for. So what does it actually take to coach and win at those levels? What is it that the athletes actually require that's contemporary and appropriate for today, and really being able to meet the athletes' needs? Pay parity is huge. It's really significant. Women get offered the same job at half the pay or no pay at all. It comes out significantly in all of the conversations that we still have, which sounds ridiculous to say, but is true, that we actually need dedicated resources given to actually pay women to coach. Most of them are still doing it in a voluntary capacity, even at the Olympic and Paralympic level, which is ridiculous. And even if they are doing the same job or have better credentials, they're always paid less. So we've now collected, we actually audit the national sporting organisations' spend now around this, so we know it's true. And therefore it's really difficult for women coaches to have sensible conversations at home with their partners about why they're going to be travelling 200 days in an Olympic year away from their family when they're not being paid. So having sensible adult conversations is not possible at the moment with the way that we're structured. It also means that we don't retain, and as we saw from the Commonwealth Games to Commonwealth Games cycle, and it means that we don't progress either. Development's a really big area of interest of mine as well. Again, dedicated resources for women coaches and for all coaches in that matter. We don't develop, we don't spend enough serious money on development. We do ad hoc things where we ask people for favours, but we actually need dedicated resources in the space to develop coaches properly, and have a really good perspective around supporting coaches who have ambition and want to grow. So and don't see that as a negative, and it's still perceived, especially in women, as a negative. And the job paradigm. So the jobs are currently constructed and are using a really old traditional model that doesn't really suit the way that we live our lives today. So I think that we could really start to rethink and reimagine the needs of sports and athletes, and think about, you know, how we could learn from other sectors and bring some of that in. People always say to me, you know, it's a really hard job. That's why women, you know, struggle. And I'm going, yeah, okay, so because women don't do things that are hard, but also the fact that they have to manage, there's still those traditional, you know, expectations from society about the types of roles that they play at home, in the home as well, that need to be talked about, which links to the pay parity. But the job paradigm is really one that I think we can address. At the moment, we still very rarely see job share in coaching. But actually, you know, athletes, because coaches like to believe they need to be there all the time, and they don't. And I think that that it's really healthy for athletes to have different inputs as well. And I think that the earlier that type of work starts in coaching, the better, because I think the more athletes can sample the type of coaching that's going to serve them well when they get to the top end of their game, then and then be able to make good choices about the type of coaching that's going to support them to be a high performer. I think the more sampling they can have along the way is going to be really useful. Picking up on James said too, is that this is about productive, healthy humans, you know, as a coach, not just as players, but really supporting, developing and producing productive, healthy humans, because it's a challenging environment, but it's a basic requirement, you know, for all of our coaches to be in that space. So that's your lot. Yeah.
Of course, we have some time for questions. Tessa and Joe, if you can get ready. Who would like to ask a question? Here we go.
Sarah.
Walshy.
Easy one, Sarah.
Hi, Darlene. You've lately been invited into the Male Champions of Change group. Can you tell us a little bit about that work and what you spoke to them about?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to them a little bit about the data. We also spoke around some of the challenges, I guess, of how women coaches are portrayed in the media, and what the influential men in that group could do to help. And I guess I'm looking at the audience here thinking it must be 50-50 male, female in the audience as well. So, you know, like, as Sarah will know as well, like men have a significant role to play, and that's the role of that particular group, is working out the role that men have to play in changing this landscape. And so I think that what we're looking at there is doing something significant with their help around the critical mass. So how do we get this huge shift and large number of female coaches involved in high performance quickly and in a supported way with significant resources to make sure that it's set up for success. So I guess what we talked to them about was not about placing one in each AFL club again where they are ignored, but actually how do we get a groundswell and a large number, and what would be the project that we'd create to do that. So it's just the initial stages.
That suggests that part of solutions would include the other off-the-field roles that go along, and I was wondering whether the research had identified anything around having, you know, like the high-performance manager for the sport, or the CEO, or the other executive managers of sports, whether that makes a difference to women coaches feeling supported, and having women in those other roles, visible and active and influential, makes a difference to how coaches feel.
Yeah, it's a good question, because we have really low numbers across the board in all of those critical roles, leadership roles. So female CEOs are about 23% across all of the national sporting organisations in Australia, and the performance director one's even lower than the coaching. What we're hearing from the women is it's not just so much that they need more women, they need a more particular type of person. And I actually think that one of the challenges we've had as a system is we've been recruiting the same type of man as well, and I think we're excluding a whole range of men who could be much better in those roles as well through the same type of bias that we apply across recruitment and selection. So it's a really interesting kind of time at the moment to look at that more holistically, and that's why I think these conversations are actually opening up a whole range of other conversations around how we could improve the plight for men as well that also don't get recruited to that roles because they have a different philosophy or approach or or personal style or vulnerabilities, so they're excluded as well.
Just one from me then, Darlene. Where are some of the ways the coaches can look at some of the traits that you were talking about before? Where can they go to explore that about themselves or the people that they work with?
Well, we're just about to publish the first set of data, which takes us back to kind of London. But we run a whole range of kind of programs and processes as well, which we can share with Helen to kind of share. We've actually been doing some work with Sarah, and we're around the women coaches in football, and we're also been doing some work with the coach education in football to look at the pro diploma as well, as a way of kind of shifting the focus away from what it's we've been doing some work to evaluate that. So there's a whole range of kind of different, I think, bits and pieces.
Great. Any final questions for Darlene? Well, join me in thanking Darlene. Thank you so much. It was lovely to see you again.